Good afternoon. My name is Terry McGuire, and I'm a member of the Kennett Underground Railroad Center. Um, what I'm going to be doing today is to share with you a presentation on women of the American anti-slavery movement. It's a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to be recording this, and this is something that you'll be able to access on your own. But the first thing I'm going to do is to share the screen. And so I'm going to click this little button here and click on this, and then open up the PowerPoint, which is right here. Now, I've been a teacher for 44 years, and yet I find that I'm a little too self-conscious of looking at myself giving a talk. So what I'm going to do is just erase the image of me, but you're going to continue to hear my voice. Now I'm going to go into the slideshow and start telling you about a little bit about the Kennett Underground Railroad Center. This is an organization that was begun over 20 years ago. And the purpose is to preserve the heritage and engage the public, that's you, about the historic abolitionists, those who were trying to secure freedom for enslaved people, and also to celebrate the freedom seekers themselves, those who were rejecting the idea that they were slaves and trying to escape into a better life. So a KRC colleague of mine and a professor who was a professor at the Westchester University wisely states that the first abolitionists in America were the first enslaved people who tried to escape. They were refusing to accept that status. And probably shortly after the first kidnapped Africans were brought to these shores in 1619. On this page, you'll see 11 women who were involved in the movement to abolish slavery in the 19th century. A few were born in the late 18th century, most were born in the 19th. Some were white women who wrote and lectured around the country, mostly in northern states, about the injustice and the inhumanity and the moral degeneration of slavery. Some here are African Americans, either freedom seekers who succeeded and became spokespersons for their cause, or freeborn Blacks who spoke up for their own oppressed people. Some were station keepers, those whose homes they opened up to host runaways on their way to freedom. Initially, that freedom was to be found in the northern states, such as Pennsylvania, but after 1850, they had to travel all the way to Canada. A few of them are conductors, those persons who helped lead and guided freedom seekers on their way. Of course, the most famous of these is Harriet Tubman. Almost certainly the best known person associated with the Underground Railroad. She was born Araminta or Minty Ross. She escaped herself from Maryland to Pennsylvania in 1849. Though almost immediately she realized that she was going to be having to do additional trips, and she made 19 additional trips, during which time she led 70 to 100 persons to freedom, and she gave instructions to a great many more. Though she was illiterate, she became a well-regarded speaker who raised money for her own journeys and to galvanize Northern opinion against slavery. During the Civil War, she acted as a scout, a nurse, a cook, and a squad leader for Union troops in the Civil War. She is, in fact, the only person, the first woman to lead a military raid. It was fairly small, but nonetheless, that's something she did during the war. After the war, she worked tirelessly for the rights of former slaves and for those of women. She was constantly helping people who had been enslaved, both family members and those whom she adopted. Lucretia Mott was born a Quaker on Nantucket Island off Massachusetts. She attended and she later taught at a school called the Nine Partners, a Quaker boarding school that is now called the Oakwood School. There she met James Mott, whom she married. Lucretia Mott became a traveling minister known for her great speaking ability, though she is best known as the grandmother, you'd say, of the suffrage and women's rights movement. Her first major advocacy was her opposition to slavery. She joined William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society and became one of the leading voices in America on this cause. In 1840, with her husband, James, and with Garrison and other Americans, she attended the London World's Anti-Slavery Convention. There, however, she and the other women were allowed to attend, but not to participate. They had to sit in the balcony. That insult was one factor in leading her to organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, from which there emerged the first major important statement on rights of women in America. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments. You can see down here at the bottom of the many people signatures that were signed, and she was one of the organizers of it. Sojourner Truth, here we go, just a second. She was born a slave in New York State. Her name was Isabella Bumfree. She was much imbued by her enslaved mother with a powerful sense of right and wrong, and also of faith in God. She was tall and physically powerful, and she was also much abused and overworked. And eventually, in 1827, she ran away and asserted her own freedom. She found shelter with a Quaker couple who eventually paid for her freedom. She continued to work for white people, but she was never really well treated. She was taken advantage of by whites for whom she worked, especially there were religious con men who she seemed to have taken up with, as a servant. In 1843, she threw off her connection to society and work and ran off to be on her own. She took the name Sojourner Truth. And she was a speaker at religious revivals. She accepted no money, just a place to sleep and some food. She too was illiterate, but she became very well known as a powerful speaker who gave sermons and denounced slavery. She was also a very powerful singer. And on one occasion, when a religious revival meeting that she attended was about to be broken up by a horde of troublemaking white youth, she started singing and she quieted them down. They were so impressed with her. Eventually, she asked them, after entertaining them with her songs, if they would leave, and they did. As she gained fame, she became allied with some of the most prominent abolitionists of the time, such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Eventually, Truth became a major spokeswoman for women's rights as well as anti-slavery. In 1851, she gave a speech in Ohio that has become one of the most famous in American history. It starts and has the refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" in which she spoke of all the ways in which she was equal to a man. She supported the Union effort in the Civil War, especially in recruiting for the so-called colored troops. Abraham Lincoln invited Truth to the White House, and he was much impressed with her. After the war, she spoke and acted on behalf of equality among the races and among sexes. Delia Webster was born in Vermont. She attended Oberlin College in Ohio, which was known for its abolitionist fervor, which she and other students gained. Um, a gifted teacher, she and another Oberlin couple set up a girls' finishing school in Lexington, Kentucky. There she combined her teaching with Underground Railroad activity, really leading a double life. With another Oberlin graduate, Calvin Fairbank, she arranged the escape of a Black family from Kentucky into Ohio. The father of that family, Lewis Hayden, became a speaker for abolitionist groups and the Underground Railroad agents, where they settled in New England. When Fairbank and she, Webster, returned to Kentucky, they were arrested and prosecuted for slave stealing. Incriminating evidence was found for each of them, and he was sentenced to 15 years in penitentiary, and she to 2. Now, she was released after only 2 months with a pardon from the governor. She had to publicly express sorrow for her actions, which she did. However, she didn't mean it. She returned to Kentucky to a farm she ran, and there she still operated a station for the Underground Railroad. Kentuckians finally caught on to her and were furious with her. Webster barely escaped into Indiana, where she still tried to run the farm and an Underground Railroad station at a distance. In the meantime, she began the lecture circuit for abolitionist organizations and was popular because she had actually lived and functioned in a slave state. She and her friend, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, acted as nurses during the Civil War, a common theme for these women abolitionists. Dinah Mendenhall, along with her husband, Isaac, provided one of the major stations in Chester County, the first one coming up the Kennett Pike from Wilmington. Now, their friends meeting Old Kennett, just off Route 1. The building is still there, though it's not an active meeting anymore. Largely disapproved of the Mendenhall's participation in the Underground Railroad. Like all Quakers, the meeting opposed slavery. It felt that Quakers should be concerned with their own people and with spiritual matters, not worldly matters. At one time, 14 fugitives arrived on a Saturday night, and they had to be kept over to the next day. But the next day, the Mendenhalls were hosting a breakfast for their meeting members, some of whom opposed the work. The fugitives had to be hidden until the last morning visitor left. Another time, in September of 1851, they hosted 4 men who were escaping from what was called the Christiana Riot, or Christiana Resistance, where free and fugitive Black farm workers staged a pitched battle with a former slave owner, his son, and a federal marshal who were coming to collect some of their property. The whites were wounded or killed, and the fugitives headed for Canada to escape recapture. Because this armed resistance truly scared and aroused pro-slavery whites, many federal marshals were seeking the escapees and were being charged with treason. Treason punishable by death. Dinah wrote that she was very scared, for, quote, harboring them subjected us to heavy fines and imprisonment. But I held to my faith in an overriding providence, and we came through it safely. Eventually, Isaac was read out of his meeting. That means expelled from the Kennett Friends meeting. And the Mendenhalls became one of the founding members of the Pennsylvania Yearly Meeting of Progressive Friends, where all manner of social reform issues could be discussed. Even non-Quakers were allowed to speak, and they hosted such people as Garrison, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. On June 20th, 1862, Dinah was one of a contingent of 6 Quakers from Chester County who met with Abraham Lincoln in the White House. They were in the White House to urge Lincoln to use his then considerable powers, war powers, to grant freedom to millions of African Americans enslaved at the time. Lincoln was polite, but he made no commitments to the group. However, just over a month later, on July 22nd, Lincoln shared with his cabinet the first draft of what was to become the Emancipation Proclamation. Dinah and the others may well have had a major impact on American history. Here's another woman who was born a Quaker in Canada, but she spent most of her life in the United States. As a young reader, she was horrified by accounts of the slave trade and slavery in the American South, and she became determined to do something about that problem in her life. She moved to the United States and married, lived in Southeast Michigan, where in 1837, she and her husband founded an integrated co-ed school, the first of its kind in that state, and among the first anywhere in the country. She also joined an anti-slavery society and began to operate an underground railroad station, continuing that even after her husband died. She traveled around the Midwest to help create stations and to help freedom seekers. She was sometimes faced with violence from slave hunters, but she defied them and kept on her work. At one point, a bounty was placed on her head of $3,000, dead or alive. This frail little woman that you see, whose picture you see here. She established schools in Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario in Canada for the education of those who had escaped slavery. Perhaps most remarkably, she traveled in the South, sometimes posing as a light-skinned slave, and gave guidance to those who wished to escape. She visited plantations and learned about slavery firsthand. During the Civil War, she acted as a nurse and set up more schools for former enslaved people in Kansas. After the war, she worked for the Freedmen's Bureau, the organization that was trying to settle the newly freed slaves, and actively promoted the concept not just of abolition, but of racial equality. In 1881, she wrote the book that is shown here, Women's Life Work, The Labors and Experience of Laura S. Haviland. And she lived for yet another 17 years. A statue of Haviland stands in the Michigan County seat in Adrian, Michigan. There she is with her book and her little bonnet. She was apparently a very tiny woman and a very brave one. Grace Anna Lewis was the daughter of John and Esther Lewis, and they were both supporters of the Underground Railroad. After John's death, Esther continued to act as a station keeper, but sometimes hired fugitives to work for her and to earn money for their journey northward. Once, Grace Anna and her two younger sisters witnessed two such workers being recaptured and brought back in chains, never to be heard from again. Those three sisters, Elizabeth and Marianne, and Grace Anna, they resolved to continue to act as station keepers after their mother died. It was not uncommon for the Lewis sisters to nurse exhausted or wounded freedom seekers back to health over long periods of time. They too hired fugitives to work on the farm if they wished to earn money. In a story that is told in a book on the Underground Railroad in Chester County, once while Grace Anna was in town shopping, she overheard some townsfolk speaking about the fact that the Lewis sisters used to be involved in the Underground Railroad, but not so much anymore. And she smiled because she knew that her family had helped 40 freedom seekers just that week. After the Civil War, Grace Anna turned her attention to scientific study, particularly ornithology, the study of birds, and botany. She became a member of the American Academy of Sciences. She was an excellent artist of nature, and 50 of her drawings were displayed at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Frances Watkins Harper was born free to free Black parents, was well educated. She was a gifted poet and writer of fiction. One of her poems, Bury Me in a Free Land, and a public speech that she gave, The Education and Elevation of the Colored Race, were highly regarded and gave her considerable fame. Supported by the State Anti-Slavery Society of Maine and other groups, Harper became a popular and well-respected speaker and advocate for abolition throughout the Northeast and Midwestern states. Her talks demonstrated her education and her logical mind, which gave the lie to the Southern racist arguments that African Americans were not intelligent enough to function while free. After the Civil War, she continued to publish poems, but also spoke on behalf of women's rights, particularly those of Black women. With Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, and others, she co-founded the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 to promote rights and improve life for those citizens. Here are two more consecutive wives of Eusebius Bernard, Sarah Painter Bernard, Sarah Marsh Bernard. All three were dedicated station keepers. Both Sarahs came from families that were involved in the Underground Railroad. No stories are recorded about Sarah Painter, apart from the fact that her children, Elizabeth, Enos, and Eusebius R., all were taught to take the task of being station keepers and conductors as a mere sacred duty. Sarah Marsh had often been a conductor of freedom seekers to the next station from her parents' home, as she had no brothers. She became adept at disguising her charges, sometimes dressing them in Quaker garb and conveying them to the Philadelphia food market on a Sunday. One of the Marsh's neighbors, while neither a supporter nor an antagonist of the Underground Railroad, was curious and kept track of the Marsh's unexpected visitors. Over the course of a year, she believed she had seen 60 guests pass through their hands. The neighbor concluded that the Marshes, quote, didn't do it for nothing. They wouldn't harbor and feed that many in a year without getting paid for some way. Apparently, she could not imagine that the Marshes and so many others like them were being rewarded, but they were being rewarded in coin of a different realm, a heavenly realm. Anna Maria Weems is the youngest person that I'm presenting here. She was born in 1840 to a free Black father, but an enslaved mother, and children always took the condition of the mother. She and her siblings were inherited by a family that was deep in debt. Therefore, they begin to sell the siblings. Now, there were some Quaker benefactors in Great Britain. I don't know how this happened, but they set up a fund to purchase the family members, but some of them were still sold south. So 15-year-old Anna Marie ran away to Washington, D.C. and found shelter with the Bigelows, a Quaker family who were station keepers of the Underground Railroad. The Bigelow family doctor, Elwood Harvey, also favored abolition. And he had Weems dress up this way, as you see him, as a young man and act as his driver. Soon, Weems reached Philadelphia and the offices of William Still of the Pennsylvania Antislavery Society, who took down her story. Eventually, Weems was reunited with family members in Ontario, Canada, and presumably they're still there now. The last person I want to talk about is Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Um, she was born in Wilmington, Delaware in 1823. Her father, Abraham, was a shoemaker and a shopkeeper there, but the family moved to Westchester in Pennsylvania so that he could further support his other job, which was that of a station keeper for the Underground Railroad. She was educated at a Quaker school in Westchester. She became a teacher and helped her with her family's support of the Underground Railroad. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Mary Ann Shadd moved to Ontario. There she married Thomas Carey and opened a school for Black and white children. She became the first Black woman publisher in North America, a weekly abolitionist paper called The Provincial Freeman. She was a primary writer and reporter and distributor and salesperson. Her husband died and she continued to do this work and to teach, but it was becoming extremely difficult for her. A friend of hers found work for her in helping to raise troops for the Civil War. She moved back to the United States, to Washington, D.C., and she continued to teach there while earning a law degree from Howard University. She became one of the first Black female lawyers in this country, one with a law degree. She was a great public speaker and a social activist, advocating for passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed rights for the people who had been freed from slavery. She engaged in the fight for women's suffrage, as so many of these people did, joining the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she spoke at their national convention in 1878. Recently, this statue of her was dedicated in North Buxton, Ontario, where she married, lived, and taught school. These 11 are but a small sampling of the women who made a difference in the struggle to erase what has been called America's original sin, slavery. They represent a broad range of backgrounds and experiences, but they all believe that the opening words of the Declaration of Independence were truer, more important, and more worthy of allegiance than any of the laws and customs of the times in which they lived. And as we know today, their efforts, while largely successful, are not yet completed. There is more work to be done. If you'd like to find out more information about this, please feel free to contact us at info@kennetundergroundrr.org. That's our email address, or visit our website at www.kennetundergroundrr.org. Thank you.